Today, we'll go over a recap of all the executions from May and the upcoming executions scheduled for June 2025. May 2025 was a busy month on death row. 5 inmates were executed in less than 30 days. 5 names, 5 stories, 5 endings. Some died in silence. Others used their final breath to point fingers. There was remorse, anger, indifference, and controversy. Protests, issues with lethal injection drugs, claims of innocence, and even last-minute statements no one saw coming. In this video, we'll go through every execution carried out in the United States during May 2025, one by one. Who they were, what crimes they committed, what they said before dying, and how they faced their final sentence.
You are watching Final Sentence.
Jeffrey Hutchinson was executed on May 1st, 2025, in the state of Florida. He died by lethal injection after spending more than 2 decades on death row. But his story didn't begin in a prison cell. It began inside a house that looked like any other, until it became the scene of a massacre. It was a quiet night in Crestview, Florida. Warm air, still streets, and homes lined up in silence. Inside one of them, Jeffrey, a Gulf War veteran, lived with his partner, Renee Flaherty, and her 3 children: Jeffrey, age 9, Amanda, age 7, and little Logan, just 4. Something happened that night. A fight, a snap, a breaking point. At 11:07 p.m., a chilling 911 call came in. A man's shaky voice, almost detached, said just one sentence: "I just shoot my family." Police arrived minutes later. They found Hutchinson in the garage, still holding the phone. He didn't try to run. He didn't say a word. Inside the house, the bodies of Renee and the 3 children were found, all killed by shotgun blasts. The weapon, a 12-gauge Mossberg, was lying in the kitchen. Gunshot residue was found on Hutchinson's hands. Tissue from one of the victims was on his clothes. At trial, Hutchinson claimed 2 masked men broke into the home and committed the murders, but there were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no footprints, only him, the shotgun, and that 911 call. In 2001, he was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He received 3 death sentences for the children and life in prison for Renee. Over the years, he claimed to suffer from mental illnesses linked to his military service, PTSD, Gulf War Syndrome. He even claimed the government was targeting him for speaking out about veteran-related health issues. His attorneys filed appeal after appeal, arguing he was mentally unfit for execution. All were denied. In April 2025, a judge ruled that Hutchinson was fully aware of what was about to happen. There were no more delays, no more defenses. On May 1st, 2025, at Florida State Prison, he was offered a final meal. He declined. No requests, no comments, just silence. At 8:10 p.m., he was escorted to the execution chamber. He wore a beige uniform. He said nothing. They laid him on the gurney and strapped him down. In the viewing room, 3 witnesses sat in silence. At 8:14, a prison official asked if he had any final words. He said nothing, just a faint mumble, too quiet to understand. At 8:15, the drugs were administered. His body trembled slightly. There were a few spasms, then stillness. At 8:22 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Jeffrey Hutchinson died without asking for forgiveness, without admitting guilt, and without saying a single final word, and his story, finally, came to an end. Now, we move on to the next execution, carried out 14 days later.
You are watching Final Sentence.
Glenn Edward Rogers, better known as the Casanova Killer, has just been executed at Florida State Prison by lethal injection. His death marks the end of a story defined by deceit, superficial charm, and a string of brutal murders that left a trail of blood across several U.S. states.
Today, Governor Ron DeSantis officially signed the death warrant for Glenn Rogers, nearly 3 decades after his conviction rocked the Bay Area. The suspected serial killer was convicted in the brutal stabbing of Tina Cribbs in 1995. This video from our archive shows the moment police finally arrested Rogers.
He was 62 years old and had spent nearly 3 decades on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs, a woman he met at a bar and with whom he spent her final hours alive in a Tampa motel. But the crime for which he was convicted was not the only one he confessed to. During interrogations, Glenn claimed to have killed more than 70 people, although that number could never be verified. Among his most chilling confessions, he even stated that he was the real killer of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, the victims in the infamous O.J. Simpson case. He earned the nickname the Casanova Killer for his seductive charm. He was handsome, polite, and knew exactly what to say to gain the trust of lonely women. But behind that charming smile hid a violent, impulsive, and dangerous psychopath. This is the full account of his crimes, his capture, and his final hours before execution, like you've never heard it before. It all began on the night of November 5, 1995, at a bar called Showtown USA, located in Gibsonton, Florida. A small place with dim lights and country music, frequented by locals, carnival workers, and sideshow performers. That night, between beers and quiet conversation, Tina Marie Cribbs, who was at the bar with friends, met Glenn Rogers. He seemed charming, blonde, light-eyed, with a calm smile. He approached naturally, ordered her a beer, and started talking as if they'd known each other for years. No one at the bar noticed anything unusual. Tina seemed comfortable, and he was attentive and polite. He offered to give her a ride home, and she agreed. But Glenn didn't take her home. Instead, he drove her to a roadside motel, the Tampa 8 Inn, and persuaded her to share a room with him. No one knows exactly what happened in the hours that followed. On the morning of November 7, 1995, 2 days after their meeting at the bar, the housekeeping staff at the Tampa 8 Inn approached room 119 after noticing it hadn't been vacated. They knocked on the door. No response. When they entered, the silence was heavy. Everything appeared oddly tidy until they saw the bathtub. Tina Marie Cribbs' body was partially submerged in the water, lying face up in the tub. She was clothed, wearing a damp t-shirt, underwear, and socks. On the bathroom floor, authorities found a pile of wet clothes and blood-stained towels. Investigators determined that Cribbs had been stabbed to death and showed signs of defensive wounds. She had 2 clean, deep stab wounds, precise and deliberate. Forensic evidence revealed a laceration on her left wrist, considered a defensive injury, as well as multiple bruises and abrasions on her torso, suggesting that she fought for her life in the moments before her death. It was also established that she remained conscious during the attack and that both wounds were inflicted with significant force and intent, including a 90-degree twist of the knife while it was still inside her body, causing extreme and prolonged pain before her death. After that horrific act, he locked the door from the inside, sliding the deadbolt, and slipped out through the bathroom window, leaving behind only a faint mark on the shower curtain. Though Tina's body was in the bathtub, her purse was missing, and more importantly, so was her car. It didn't take police long to understand what had happened. Witnesses described a tall blonde man with a charming smile and a southern vibe. The name Glenn was mentioned by one of the victim's friends who had heard him introduce himself that night. With that lead, an interstate alert was issued for Tina Marie Cribbs' white Ford Festiva. Meanwhile, Glenn Rogers was already heading north, crossing several states without leaving a trace. He had mastered the art of disappearing. He stayed in roadside motels, paid in cash, and used different names. He knew how to move without being tracked. It seemed like he had done this before. On November 13th, just 6 days after the murder, Glenn was arrested in Richmond, Kentucky after a high-speed chase. He was still driving Tina's car. Some say he had a smile on his face, as if he had already calculated that he would be caught, as if prison was just another part of the game. During questioning, he didn't take long to start talking, but what he said left detectives frozen, because Glenn Rogers didn't just confess to killing Tina, he said he had killed many more, women in different states, dozens, maybe over 70, and among those names he slipped in 2 that no one expected to hear: Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. But that part was just beginning. When Rogers was arrested in Kentucky, the police didn't expect to find the monster he claimed to be. During interrogations, without a trace of remorse, Glenn began to talk, and what he said turned a local case into an interstate nightmare. He said this wasn't the first time he had killed, or the second, or the third. He claimed to have murdered women in Louisiana, Mississippi, Ohio, California, and other states. He mentioned bodies that had never been found, names the press had never heard, and methods that varied with each case, as if murder to him was a kind of macabre art form. At first, police were skeptical. Another compulsive liar? A killer desperate for fame? But the details were too precise. He knew where certain unsolved murders had occurred. He remembered dates, clothing colors, specific wounds. Some of it matched cold cases sitting in police files. One of the most attention-grabbing cases was the murder of Linda Price, a woman from Jackson, Mississippi whom Rogers met while working as a painter. He began a relationship with her, and shortly after, Linda was found brutally stabbed and left in her own home. He was also linked to the death of Sandra Gallagher in California, whose car was set on fire, with her inside. Rogers had been seen with her days before the crime, but the most disturbing part came later. During a phone call from prison to his brother Clay, Glenn hinted at having been involved in the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, the victims in the infamous O.J. Simpson case. On the night of June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were brutally murdered outside Nicole's residence in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Both were stabbed multiple times, and their bodies were discovered at the entrance of the house. Nicole had been a victim of domestic violence during her marriage to O.J. Simpson, a former NFL star, and had previously expressed fear for her safety. O.J. Simpson was arrested and charged with the murders, sparking one of the most sensational trials in American history. The 11-month-long process was marked by relentless media coverage, debates around race and celebrity, and iconic moments, like the infamous glove that didn't fit. Despite the evidence presented, on October 3, 1995, the jury found Simpson not guilty of both murder charges. However, in 1997, a civil court found Simpson liable for the deaths and ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages to the victims' families. This civil verdict carried no criminal consequences, and Simpson never served time for the murders. The case left an indelible mark on American society, sparking debates about the justice system, the influence of celebrity, and racial tensions. To this day, the double homicide of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman remains a symbol of controversy and public division. Glenn Rogers claimed that Nicole had paid him to steal some jewelry, and that once inside the house, things spiraled out of control. He said he killed both victims. Although he was never formally charged with the double murder, his confession revived theories that suggested a third man may have been involved. Experts are divided. Some believe Rogers made it all up. Others argue he was capable of it. He had been in Los Angeles at the time, and records show he worked in homes around Beverly Hills. His own brother publicly stated that he believed Glenn was telling the truth, as he explained in a 2012 documentary. As the years went by, the number of victims attributed to Rogers continued to grow. Some sources have linked him to more than 70 murders, although most were never confirmed. He often changed his story. Sometimes he claimed responsibility, other times he denied it. He played games with police, prosecutors, and the media, as if he knew that no matter what they said, they would never be able to complete the puzzle. The truth is, just days before the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs, he had killed another woman, Linda Price. Later, after his arrest following the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs, investigators began linking Rogers to the Linda Price case. During his trial, evidence was presented connecting him to multiple crimes, including the murder of Linda Price. The case of Linda Price was one of the first in which Glenn Rogers was identified as a possible serial killer. Although he was never convicted of Linda's murder, his involvement in this crime established a pattern that would repeat itself in other states. Continuing chronologically, after his arrest and the accumulation of evidence, Glenn Rogers was brought to trial for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. Despite his ambiguous and contradictory confessions, the case against him was solid. Physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and his criminal record were presented, leading the jury to find him guilty. In 1997, Rogers was sentenced to death in Florida. Glenn spent nearly 3 decades on death row. During that time, his statements remained unpredictable. Sometimes he confessed to other crimes, other times he denied them. His game with the authorities and the media continued, maintaining a shroud of mystery around the true extent of his victim count. Over the years, Rogers made more shocking confessions from prison. In addition to the previously mentioned murders, he claimed responsibility for other violent crimes and said he had knowledge of unsolved cases in several states. However, many of these confessions could not be verified, and some experts believe they were attempts at manipulation or bids for attention. A letter from Attorney General James Othmeyer to the governor detailed a series of appeals that had been denied over more than 2 decades. One of the most recent came in 2021, when the Florida Supreme Court rejected an appeal in which Rogers alleged newly discovered evidence of sexual abuse he claimed to have suffered in childhood, including at the now-closed Ohio Center Training Institute, a juvenile detention center. Rogers stated that the trauma had been repressed until 2019. His legal team also claimed that Rogers suffered from porphyria, a condition that could make lethal injection extremely painful and therefore inhumane. Poor guy, right? That request was also denied since the other methods of execution, firing squad and lethal gas, are not available in Florida. In addition to his conviction in Florida, Glenn Rogers faced another trial that resulted in a separate death sentence in California. This case involved the murder of Sandra Gallagher, a mother of 3 whom Rogers had met just weeks before the Tina Marie Cribbs murder. Sandra Gallagher was an ordinary woman, living what seemed to be a quiet life until it was abruptly cut short after a fateful encounter in a Van Nuys bar in California. There, Rogers once again used his charm and charisma to quickly earn Sandra's trust. What seemed to be a fleeting, harmless relationship turned into horror. In 1995, Sandra was found dead by strangulation in her own home. Investigators uncovered signs of struggle and violence, suggesting the murder was not a spontaneous act, but rather a calculated and brutal assault. Rogers was arrested and formally charged with the crime. During the California trial, the evidence presented, including testimony and physical proof, was enough for the jury to find him guilty of Sandra Gallagher's murder. In 1999, he was sentenced to death a second time. Yes, a double death sentence, this time in the state of California, reinforcing the severity of his crimes and the threat he posed as a serial killer. Finally, on May 15, 2025, Glenn Edward Rogers was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. Glenn Rogers, 62, received a lethal injection at Florida State Prison near Starka and was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. In a final statement, Rogers thanked his wife, who visited him at the prison that same day, according to visitation records. He also said, somewhat ironically, that "We will answer your questions soon," without elaborating. He also said, "President Trump, keep making America great, I'm ready to go." The lethal injection then began, and he remained silent throughout the procedure. His death closed a dark chapter, but many questions about his life and crimes remain unanswered. Despite his execution, the figure of Glenn Rogers remains an enigma for investigators and criminology experts. Was he truly responsible for the more than 70 murders he claimed? How much truth was there in his alleged involvement in the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman? His story left behind a disturbing legacy, reminding us how hard it is to uncover the truth when a killer manipulates reality. Glenn's brother, Claude Rogers, told the Tampa Bay Times, "I said goodbye to him. He's my brother and I love him. I asked God to guide him on this next journey." Michael Sheedy, executive director of the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops, wrote to Governor Ron DeSantis, "We urge you to spare the life of Glenn Rogers. We plead that it is possible to fulfill the purposes of punishment while exercising mercy. We can entrust God with the final judgment of each individual. We also pray for you, Governor, as you consider this request." What I'm going to show you now was not part of the script, but I just found it, and I want to share it with you. It's a comment from a woman on a video of Glenn Rogers' arrest.
I'll never forget the night I encountered Glenn Rogers in a bar one night when I was out with friends. The guy kept trying to pick me up. Thank God I'm not a gullible gal or made it a habit to get in cars with guys I don't know. A few days later, I saw this arrest going down on TV, and when they zoomed in on his face, I about fell over. It was the same guy trying to pick me up a few nights earlier. I later found out he murdered all these women and seemed to pick chicks with red or auburn hair. That's when it dawned on me why he was trying so hard to pick me up that night. ... I have auburn hair. Thank God. I was a sensible chic who didn't get into cars with guy I've just met. I could have been one of his victims.
Matthew Lee Johnson was executed by lethal injection on Tuesday, May 20th, 2025, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 49 years old and had spent more than a decade on death row after being convicted of murdering a 76-year-old woman. Johnson was the fourth inmate executed in Texas so far this year and the 16th in the United States. 1 week before his execution, he wrote a letter addressed to the victim's family. It read, "This is the end, but for me, it's the beginning of life. I truly love you, Mrs. Harris, and I'm sorry. I pray that we meet in eternity and live together forever." On May 20th, 2012, Nancy Judith Harris, a mother of 4, began her day like any other. The store had just opened at 7 a.m. at the Fina Whip Inn in Garland, Texas, and Harris, who was working alone, expected to spend her day selling coffee, sodas, and snacks. Suddenly, Matthew Johnson walked into the store, intending to commit one of the most cruel and inhumane acts a person can carry out. I need to be honest with you. When I first read about this case, and even now, as I recount it, I can't stop a few tears from sliding down my cheek. Personally, I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but knowing that this demon named Matthew is no longer walking this earth, I must admit, it brings me a strange sense of relief. Inside the store was Nancy Harris, 76 years old, a woman well known in the neighborhood for her kindness and dedication. She was alone, as usual, preparing the shop for the day. When the monster entered, he was holding a plastic bottle. He had filled it beforehand with a flammable liquid. Johnson approached Harris, demanded money, and as she began gathering cash to hand over, without waiting, this subhuman creature poured the flammable liquid over her head and torso. Confused and trying to remain calm, Harris attempted to open the register quickly, hoping the thief would take the money and leave. But he had other plans, because the liquid wasn't water. Matthew took out his lighter and set her on fire. Security cameras captured Johnson walking away calmly, while Harris, engulfed in flames, tried desperately to extinguish the fire using a sink. When she realized she couldn't, she ran outside, crying for help. According to testimony, 2 police officers who saw the blaze and heard Harris's screams used a fire extinguisher to put out the flames. It's unclear whether the fire was actually extinguished by the officers or by nearby neighbors and passers-by who had also rushed over to help. What is certain is that someone called emergency services. When paramedics arrived shortly afterward, the woman pleaded with them to help her. "Help me, help me, help me," she begged. Nancy was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors confirmed she had 2nd to 4th degree burns over 40% of her body. What already seemed like a tragedy quickly turned into a nightmare for the Harris family. Despite the medical team's best efforts, Harris made it clear she did not want to be kept alive if she couldn't live as she used to. Her quality of life was going to deteriorate so drastically that she decided the best course of action was to be taken off life support. And just 5 days later, she died from the severity of her injuries. But before being hospitalized, after the brutal attack, Nancy Harris was still conscious and managed to give police a detailed description of her attacker. An African-American man, heavyset, with a round face and short hair. Thanks to her statement and the officer's swift response, a manhunt began immediately in the neighborhood. Approximately 1 hour later, Johnson was found in a nearby residential area. He was attempting to enter several properties when police confronted him. After a brief foot chase, he was arrested. In his possession were Harris's ring, cash, cigarettes, and lighters stolen from the store. He also had burns on his hands and traces of flammable liquid on his clothes. As we say in my country, if it barks, walks on 4 legs, and wags its tail, don't doubt it. It's a dog. During the police interrogations, Johnson confessed to committing the crime. He claimed that he had been drinking and using drugs the night before, and that his intention was only to scare Harris into giving him the money. However, the evidence and witness testimonies presented during the trial made it clear that his actions were deliberate and premeditated. On November 8, 2013, a Dallas County jury found him guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. During the trial, Nancy Harris's family expressed their pain and anger. One of her sons stated, "I'll be there the day the state of Texas straps you to that gurney and sends you to meet your maker." I want to apologize if I've used strong language. I know you didn't come to this channel to hear my personal opinion, but rather to learn the facts. Still, I can't help but think of my own mother or my grandmother who is no longer with us. Good people, people who never wished harm on anyone. And the thought that repugnant demons like Matthew exist in this world truly awakens the darkest feelings in me. Now, back to the case. Ironically, the date chosen for his execution was May 20th, 2025, exactly 13 years after the crime. Yes, you heard that right. Exactly 13 years. It was on May 20th, 2012, that Matthew attacked this woman, and on May 20th, 2025, he was executed. Matthew Johnson was executed by the state of Texas at the Huntsville unit. Since 2011, Texas abolished the right to request a special last meal, so he was served the standard prison breakfast. He was escorted to the execution chamber. The lethal injection process began. Johnson closed his eyes, and within minutes his breathing stopped. With his execution, Johnson became the 4th person put to death in Texas in 2025. Now, let's turn to the case of Benjamin Ritchie. On May 20th, 2025, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was executed by lethal injection at the Indiana State Prison, located in Michigan City. This marked only the 2nd execution in the state since 2009, following a long hiatus due to the shortage of drugs used in capital punishment. Ritchie, 45, was convicted for the murder of police officer William Toney in the year 2000. Despite multiple appeals and requests for clemency, citing mental disorders and brain damage, his execution proceeded as scheduled.
Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita pushing for the execution of a man convicted of killing a cop. Rokita now asking the state Supreme Court to set an execution date for Benjamin Ritchie for May 20th.
On September 29, 2000, in Beech Grove, Indiana, a 20-year-old Benjamin Ritchie, along with 2 accomplices, stole a white pickup truck from a gas station. Police located the vehicle and began a pursuit. After a brief chase, Ritchie and the others abandoned the truck and fled on foot. Officer William Toney chased after Ritchie, who, when cornered, turned and fired 4 times, striking Toney in the chest outside the protection of his bulletproof vest. Officer Toney, just 31 years old, left behind a wife and 2 small daughters. Ritchie fled the scene, but his freedom didn't last long. He was arrested the very next day at a friend's house. During his 2002 trial, the jury found him guilty of murder, auto theft, unlawful possession of a firearm, and resisting arrest. The defense argued that Ritchie suffered from mental disorders caused by a troubled childhood and fetal alcohol exposure, but the jury was unmoved. On October 15, 2002, Ritchie was sentenced to death. Over the next 2 decades, he filed numerous appeals, claiming ineffective legal representation and unacknowledged mental illness during his original trial. In 2025, he requested clemency, expressing remorse for his actions. But both the Indiana Parole Board and the governor denied the request. The state Supreme Court set his execution date for May 20th, 2025. Benjamin Ritchie was executed by lethal injection at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. As per protocol, only a few people were allowed to witness the execution, up to 5 friends and family members chosen by Ritchie. The execution began shortly after midnight, and Ritchie was pronounced dead at 12:46 a.m. For his final meal, he chose the Tour of Italy from Olive Garden, a selection of Italian dishes. Before his death, Ritchie shared his last words. "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." Following the execution, Mark Koselke, Deputy State Public Defender, released a statement expressing concern over the fairness of Ritchie's sentence. Benjamin Ritchie spent his final days reconnecting with those who love him and discovering the positive impact he had on many people's lives. Tonight was the result of prioritizing finality over fairness. We continue to believe, as did half of the Indiana Supreme Court, that Ben's execution was inappropriate. Indiana executed a man with profound brain damage and developmental disabilities, Mark Koselke, Deputy State Public Defender, in support of the execution. Indiana Governor Mike Braun issued his own statement. Since Benjamin Ritchie's conviction in 2002, his case has been heard and reviewed numerous times by both state and federal courts, including the Indiana Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, never resulting in an overturned sentence. Ritchie's final appeal for clemency was met with an unanimous recommendation from the state parole board that his execution proceeded, as scheduled. Today, Ritchie's sentence has been carried out as ordered by the court. Governor Mike Braun, the Fraternal Order of Police, FOP, also released a statement celebrating the execution. The hour has come. Nearly 25 years later, justice is fully served. The sanctity of innocent life is paramount. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. Genesis 9:6. We pray for the family of Beech Grove, Police Officer William Bill Tony End of Watch 9-29, 2000. They have patiently awaited the full measure of the law to be carried out. While this can never restore their loss, it upholds the value of Bill's life and the sacrifice that he and this family made. To the residents of Beech Grove, know that we will always stand the line for your safety and protection. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. If I may offer a personal comment, while the death of a loved one, like the officer killed by Benjamin Ritchie, would be unbearably painful and impossible to forgive for any of us, it feels somewhat unfair that he received the same sentence for a robbery, a police chase, and a shootout as a man who intentionally set out to burn a woman alive. These are completely different cases, even though both resulted in the death of an innocent person. It's not the same thing to wake up at 7 in the morning, pour flammable liquid on an elderly woman, and set her on fire for no reason, as it is to try to steal a truck, flee, and during the chase, shoot and kill a police officer. And let me be clear, I'm not justifying or legitimizing this horrific act. What I'm doing is raising the question of whether it was truly necessary to execute a prisoner who was already behind bars and who didn't seem to show signs of such severe psychopathy that he would pose a danger to society if, hypothetically, he were ever released in old age. His case seems more like one of the most extreme and tragic forms of youthful rebellion, influenced by gangs or street violence. He killed an officer who was pursuing him, and that is deeply wrong. He was judged, and that's why he was in prison. But what was the purpose of killing him? Just as I said that in the case of Matthew Lee Johnson, his death might bring some sense of relief, though I also don't agree with his execution. Because I believe only God should decide when someone dies, it doesn't seem like the world is going to be a better place after Ritchie's death. Prison is supposed to punish behavior and make the world a bit safer. But in this case, I believe the death penalty was more of a disciplinary decision, a warning to all citizens that if you kill a police officer, you will also be killed. And in that sense, it makes a certain kind of sense. But how can we apply the same sentence to a psychopathic killer like Ted Bundy as we do to Benjamin Ritchie? Do you understand my point? I'm not defending what he did. What I'm saying is that it feels excessive to impose the same punishment on someone who murdered dozens of women without any remorse and who would likely do it again if given the chance, as on a young man who shot during a chase and ended up killing a police officer. But I care about what you think. What's your opinion? Am I completely wrong? I apologize if my comment offends anyone. My intention is to open up a serious and respectful discussion. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. In the viewing chamber, the witnesses remained silent. Outside, the world went on. 2 horrific crimes. 2 killers whose lives ended with a needle, just like so many others across the United States. 2 days later, on May 22, 2025, there was another execution. Oscar Franklin Smith was executed on May 22, 2025, at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. He was 75 years old and one of the longest-serving inmates on death row in the state. After more than 3 decades, and despite maintaining his innocence until the very end, his fate was sealed. Smith became the first person in Tennessee to be executed, using the state's new single-dose pentobarbital protocol. His lawyers presented DNA evidence that could have changed the course of the case, but the courts remained firm. Governor Bill Lee denied clemency, and this morning, at exactly 10 a.m., the sentence was carried out. Let's take a look at his final words and his last meal. But to understand how it all led to this moment, we need to go back in time to an ordinary home, a quiet neighborhood, and an afternoon that seemed like any other.
You are watching Final Sentence.
October 1st, 1989, the afternoon in Nashville, Tennessee, passed without incident. In a modest home in the Woodbine neighborhood, Judith Smith was spending an ordinary day with her teenage sons, Chad and Jason. It was a typical Sunday, movies on the TV, occasional laughter, the smell of dinner in the air. Nothing suggested that their peace was about to be shattered. Judith had been married to Oscar Franklin Smith since 1985. She had Chad and Jason from a previous marriage, and Oscar also had 2 teenage children of his own. Together, they had twins, but by mid-1989, the relationship had completely fallen apart. In June, they legally separated, and from that point on, they were locked in a tense legal battle over custody of the twins. Around 5 p.m., someone knocked on the door. Judith went to answer it. On the other side stood Oscar Smith, her estranged husband, the same man she had fought with many times before, who had been violent, and with whom she was in the middle of a bitter divorce. He didn't need to say much. The conversation was tense, and it ended in shouting. Judith barely had time to turn around before the first shot rang out. She collapsed backward, wounded, in the hallway. Jason, the younger son, came running out of his room when he heard the noise and found himself staring at the scene. Oscar looked at him, cold, unflinching, and advanced. He stabbed Jason once, twice, 3 times. The boy tried to scream, but no sound came out. Chad, the older brother, tried to fight back. He threw himself at Oscar, punched him. They struggled. 2 more shots were fired. One hit his chest, the other struck his neck. In less than 5 minutes, Oscar Franklin Smith had wiped out an entire family, his own family. Judith, Chad, and Jason died at the scene. Before leaving, Oscar took a few things from the house, then calmly closed the door behind him, as if nothing had happened. The night passed, and no one noticed. The lights stayed on, the TV kept playing, and silence filled the house like time had stopped. The next morning, a 13-year-old neighbor, a friend of the boys, walked up to the door as he often did. He knocked several times, waited, called out, but there was no response. He walked around the side of the house and peeked through a window. What he saw froze him in place. He ran off screaming. Minutes later, police cars pulled up. Officers entered the home and were met with a nightmare. Judith lay in the hallway with gunshot wounds and deep lacerations. Jason was near the dining room, stabbed, eyes still wide open. Chad was on the floor of his bedroom, with 2 bullets that had ended his life almost instantly. There was blood in multiple areas, overturned furniture, a broken lamp, and a crumpled bedsheet, where, in the middle of the chaos, something stood out that not everyone noticed right away. A palm print in blood, clearly visible on the fabric, but it wasn't an ordinary print. 2 fingers were missing. The scene made it clear, and this had been a personal attack, full of rage. This wasn't a robbery or a random break-in. Someone had come into that house with the intent to kill. Police began to piece together Judith's recent life, her relationships, her contacts, and very quickly, one name stood out: Oscar Franklin Smith. It was then that details began to emerge that had not been fully known until that point. According to court records, Smith had threatened Judith on multiple occasions. 1 month before the murders, he tied her up, raped her, and told her he was going to kill her. He would frequently call the Waffle House where she worked, insulting her, threatening her, and issuing warnings. On one occasion, he even told Judith's father, "Tell Judy I've been playing with her with silk gloves, but now I'm taking them off." On another, he warned that he would kill her if she ever left him. It was also revealed that he had offered money to people willing to kill his ex-wife. Oscar and Judith were separated. There were previous reports of violence, witnesses who had heard threats, and a toxic relationship that never cooled down. In the months leading up to the crime, Oscar had taken out life insurance policies not just on Judith, but on both of her sons. For the police, that alone was enough to raise suspicion, but what truly sealed it was what they found on that sheet. Forensic experts analyzed the bloody handprint. It was a left palm, but 2 fingers were missing, the middle and the ring, the exact same 2 fingers Oscar had lost years earlier in a work accident. When experts compared the shape of his hand to the mark, there was no doubt. It matched, not just in shape, but in the angle, the wrist position, and the visible creases. It was his hand, and it was right there, beside the body of his ex-wife. With the handprint as solid evidence, police didn't need much more. Oscar Franklin Smith was arrested just over a month after the murders. He denied everything, claimed he hadn't been at the house, that he hadn't seen Judith that day, that it was all a mistake, but to investigators, the crime scene told a different story. Beyond the handprint, there was another detail that proved critical: a phone recording. During the attack, one of the boys, Chad, managed to dial the phone. On the tape, you could hear shouting and a desperate voice that would stay etched forever.
I got a light said to call me and would help me, and then the phone was cut off.
Frank, no, God, help me. Frank was Oscar's middle name. The trial began in July 1990 in Davidson County. The prosecution presented every piece of the puzzle: the previous violence, the life insurance policies, the bloody palm print, the recording. It was also revealed that Oscar had tried to fabricate an alibi by claiming he was away on a work trip, but he couldn't clearly prove where he had been at the time of the murders. The defense argued that the palm print might have been there from before, that Oscar had lived in the house and could have left it on a previous occasion, but neither the jury nor the judge believed it. During the trial, close family members of Judith also testified. Her sister, Teresa Zastrow, told police that Smith had abused Judith on multiple occasions, although she rarely spoke about it. Her father, Don Roberts, recounted that in 1988, Judith once came to their house with an unusual request. She asked them to sign a note confirming where she had been that day. According to him, one time she came home and said she needed a signed paper before she could leave. "My wife had to sign it. That was the only real clue Judy ever gave us." The verdict was unanimous. Oscar Franklin Smith was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to the maximum penalty, death by lethal injection. He spent 35 years on death row at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. During that time, he remained firm in his innocence and endured increasingly harsh conditions. In 2022, he came within hours of being executed, but received a last-minute reprieve due to failures in the lethal injection protocols. From that point on, he reported that conditions inside Riverbend had worsened, accusing the authorities of failing to follow established policies. In his final days, he was held in near-total isolation, a measure his lawyers described as an unnecessary form of torture. He was allowed contact only with his legal team, a spiritual advisor, and prison staff assigned to monitor him constantly. Despite appeals and new DNA evidence suggesting the presence of another person at the crime scene, the courts refused to reopen the case. Tennessee Governor Bill Lee also declined to intervene. According to the Tennessee Department of Correction, Smith requested hot dogs, tater tots, and an apple pie with vanilla ice cream for his final meal. However, this wasn't the first time the inmate ordered a last meal. In 2022, Smith was served a double cheeseburger, a thick crust apple pie, and vanilla ice cream as his final plate before his scheduled execution. Oscar Franklin Smith lay on the gurney, his face pale, his hands wrapped in medical tape, and his spiritual advisor praying beside him. When asked if he had any final words, he said yes. What followed was more than a goodbye. It was an accusation, a cry, a manifesto. Someone needs to tell the governor that the justice system doesn't work. He has the final word. He's the last to decide if justice is truly served. Too many innocent people are being executed. And if he can't do what's right, then he needs to stop being governor. The system is broken. He spoke calmly but with fire in his voice. Ordinary people like me don't have the knowledge that experts do, and that condemns us. If the governor doesn't realize there are more men waiting to die at Riverbend, he's a damn fool. I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. God bless him, if he ever finds the courage to do what must be done. There was a moment of silence. His spiritual advisor, now standing in front of his face, looked into his eyes. Then he looked at her and whispered, twice, almost like a confession or a plea. "I didn't kill her. I didn't kill her," she replied. "Save me a seat at the banquet table." And he, with a faint smile, answered, "I will." At 10:47 a.m., Oscar Smith was pronounced dead. After the execution, a press conference was held. Officials confirmed the timeline of the procedure, family members of the victims gave emotional statements about the impact of domestic violence, and witnesses described the final moments inside the chamber, including Smith's last words and the unusual calm that marked his death. It may sound a bit odd to say he didn't do it, especially when you consider all the coincidences, the threats, the supposed bloodstain, the life insurance policy. But we also have to remember that many innocent people have been executed in the past. And sometimes, years later, the truth comes out. They weren't guilty after all. I put together a video that tells the stories of those cases. You can find the link in the description below. Oscar Smith was executed on May 22, 2025 at 10:47 a.m., becoming the first inmate to be executed under the state's new lethal injection protocol, which uses a single dose of pentobarbital. Do you believe the suffering he endured in the final days of his life was unnecessary? What do you think about this case? We'll look at all the executions scheduled for June 2025.
You are watching Final Sentence.
Let's begin with the first one on the calendar. Anthony F. Wainwright. Crime: intimate assault and murder of Carmen Gayhart. Execution scheduled for June 10th. It seemed like any other afternoon in Lake City, Florida. A young mother, just 23 years old, was leaving the supermarket. Carmen Gayhart was loading bags into her Ford Bronco. She had a future ahead of her, a small daughter, a life to live. But she didn't know that, at that very moment, two men were watching her, and one of them had death in his eyes. Anthony F. Wainwright and Richard Hamilton had escaped from a minimum security prison in North Carolina. Two inmates on the run, with no plan, no fear, no limits. They had already stolen, already crossed several states. Now they wanted something else, a vehicle and a victim. On April 27, 1994, Carmen was approached in the parking lot of a Winn-Dixie. No witnesses, no cameras. They forced her into her vehicle and took her. For hours, they drove north through the state. They dragged her into a wooded, isolated area, far from any help. And there, in that wet and silent corner of earth, everything ended. Carmen was subjected to an intimate assault, then executed with 2 shots to the head from a .22 caliber rifle. Her body was left among leaves, branches, and mud, as if her life had meant nothing. For 2 days, no one knew where she was. No leads, no trace, until the killers made a mistake. A highway patrol unit in Mississippi spotted a suspicious vehicle. It was Carmen's Ford Bronco, but she wasn't driving. Wainwright and Hamilton were inside. When the officers tried to stop them, they sped up. The chase began. Shots were fired. The windshield shattered. A bullet grazed Wainwright's arm. The vehicle spun out, slid off the road, and stopped in a cloud of dust. The officers pulled them out by force. That's where the escape ended. At the station, Hamilton broke down, said it hadn't been his idea. He drew a map, marked a spot in the woods, and there, among twisted trees and damp ground, they found Carmen's body. The trial left no doubt. DNA, confessions, the murder weapon, the map, the vehicle. Everything pointed to the same place and the same face. In June 1995, Anthony F. Wainwright was sentenced to death. So was Hamilton. But time gave them different paths. Hamilton died in prison in 2023. Wainwright, on the other hand, spent 3 decades on death row, appealing, waiting, surviving, until now. The governor of Florida signed his death warrant. The date is set, June 10, 2025. The needle awaits at Rayford State Prison. He will be executed by lethal injection. Gregory Hunt, Alabama, convicted of intimate assault and murder. Execution scheduled for June 10th. August 2nd, 1988. Cordova, Alabama. It was early, and the town had barely started to wake. In an apartment on the 2nd floor, a woman was banging on the door to her roommate's bedroom. She was shouting her name, calling again and again. No response. The night before, they had heard noises, what sounded like a fight, but didn't think much of it. Now, the door was locked from the inside and the silence was complete. She didn't wait any longer. She called emergency services. When police arrived and forced the door open, what they found inside was something the officers of Cordova would never forget. Karen Lane, 29 years old, was lying on the floor. There was blood on the bed, on the carpet, on her clothes. Her body was covered in bruises and wounds, more than 50, 20 of them on her head alone. And before she died, she had been the victim of an intimate assault. It was a long, violent, deliberate death. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows. Nothing had been stolen. That narrowed the investigation fast. Karen knew her killer, and most likely she had let him in herself. She had ended a relationship weeks earlier. He hadn't taken it well. Gregory Hunt. Several neighbors had seen him lingering outside the building, waiting on the sidewalk, calling her non-stop. That same night, some said they heard shouting. One even claimed they heard the name Greg. Hunt was arrested the next day. He had scratches, marks on his arms, broken fingernails. His story changed every time he spoke. First, he denied seeing her. Then he said he'd stopped by. Then claimed he didn't remember. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming. His DNA was on Karen's body, and the experts confirmed signs of struggle. She fought with everything she had. It wasn't enough. The trial was held in 1990. The jury found him guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. For decades, he filed appeals, claimed the trial was unfair, said he couldn't remember, that he didn't have proper legal defense, but every court ruled the same. The crime was brutal, intentional, and premeditated. Now, Alabama is preparing to carry out the sentence. Gregory Hunt will be executed on June 10, 2025, by nitrogen hypoxia, a silent clinical method with no needles, no electricity, just a mask, gas, and a few minutes of waiting. The case that began with a scream behind a door will end in absolute silence. John Hanson, August 31st, 1999. It was a sweltering afternoon in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The parking lot at the Promenade Mall was full, cars moving in and out, rushed families, people carrying bags. Among them walked Mary Bowles. She was 77, a retired schoolteacher, a mother, a grandmother. She had lived alone since losing her husband. That day, like so many others, she left a store and headed to her car. She didn't know someone was following her. As she reached her car, 2 men intercepted her. One grabbed her arm. The other opened the door. They forced her into the back seat and climbed in with her. No one screamed. No one noticed. Within seconds, the car vanished into traffic. The men were John Hanson and Victor Miller, fugitives from a federal prison in Louisiana. They traveled the country robbing, armed, leaving no witnesses. They drove with Mary in the back seat for miles until they reached a gravel pit north of Tulsa near Owasso. They stopped, but they weren't alone. Gerald Max Thurman, 44, the property owner, noticed the unfamiliar vehicle. He walked over to check. Before he could say anything, Miller shot him. Thurman collapsed, wounded. Hanson kept going. He led Mary into a more remote area, past brush and dirt, made her walk, then shot her multiple times in the back. He covered her body with branches and left. Thurman was taken to a hospital. He survived for 2 weeks but never recovered. Mary Bowles was reported missing. Her family searched for days. Her body was found on September 7th, partially buried in the gravel pit, right where Hansen had left her. 2 days later, Hansen and Miller tried to rob a credit union in Tulsa. They failed. They were arrested. They had weapons, cash, and the same clothing witnesses had described. Forensics closed the case. Fingerprints, ballistics, DNA. In 2001, John Hansen was sentenced to death for the murder of Mary Bowles. He also received a life sentence for the murder of Gerald Thurman. His accomplice, Victor Miller, was sentenced to life without parole. Hansen spent more than 20 years in a federal prison. He was transferred to Oklahoma in March 2025. His execution is scheduled for June 12th by lethal injection at the McAllister State Penitentiary. The case never made national headlines. No big media coverage, but in the state's legal records it remains. A double murder committed in broad daylight by two men who just wanted to keep running. Stephen Stanko, April 7, 2005. Murrells Inlet, South Carolina. A quiet town, narrow streets, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Laura Ling, 43, lived with her teenage daughter in a modest neighborhood. She had started dating a man she met at the local library. His name was Stephen Stanko. She let him stay for a few days. She had no idea who she was letting in. That night, Stanko attacked. He strangled Laura to death. Then he went after her daughter. He assaulted her intimately, beat her, and cut her throat, believing he had killed her. But he hadn't. The young woman survived and managed to call for help.
How old are you?
15. I tried to put up a fight. I tried. I really did.
Did you see who did it?
Yeah. It was my mom's boyfriend.
The next morning, Stanko drove to Conway to the home of Henry Turner, a 74-year-old friend. He brought breakfast. They talked for a while. Turner went to the bathroom to shave, and there, without a word, Stanko shot him in the back using a pillow to muffle the sound. Then he shot him again in the chest. He took his truck, emptied his bank account. He fled to Augusta, Georgia, posed as a businessman attending the Masters golf tournament. A woman took him in. She later saw him on the news, recognized him, and called the police. He was arrested without resistance on April 12th. In 2006, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Laura Ling and given 110 years in prison for the assault and attempted murder of her daughter. In 2009, he received a second death sentence for the murder of Henry Turner. After years of failed appeals, South Carolina scheduled his execution for June 13, 2025. He has until May 30th to choose the method: lethal injection, electric chair, or firing squad. Comment below if his decision has already been announced. Thomas Lee Gudinas, May 23, 1994. Orlando, Florida. A humid, silent dawn. The city center was beginning to empty out. Michelle McGrath, 27, was leaving Barbarella's around 2:45 a.m. She was walking alone to her car. She never made it. At 7:30 a.m., her body was found in an alley next to a school. She was lifeless, showing clear signs of extreme violence and intimate assault. The scene was brutal. That same night, another woman, Rochelle Smith, had been followed by a man to her car. She managed to lock herself inside and escape. Later, she identified Thomas Lee Gudinas as her attacker. Gudinas had been at the same bar as Michelle. His friends testified that they lost track of him before closing. A school employee saw a man fleeing the alley where the body was later found. It was Gudinas. The evidence was overwhelming: fingerprints on Michelle's vehicle, biological traces on her body, and confessions to his roommates. One of them stated Gudinas had said, "I killed her," and then. He never finished the sentence. He didn't need to. In 1995, he was convicted of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, attempted sexual assault, and armed robbery. The sentence: death. After nearly 30 years on death row, Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. It is scheduled for June 24, 2025 at 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison in Stark. It will be Florida's 7th execution this year. All have been by lethal injection, a crime that shook Orlando in the 90s, a sentence that, after decades, is finally about to be carried out. Richard Gerald Jordan, January 14, 1976, Gulfport, Mississippi. A mild morning, gray skies. In a house in the Woodland Hills neighborhood, Edwina Martyr, 37, was home alone. She was the wife of a local businessman, a mother, a homemaker. That morning, someone knocked on the door claiming to be from a utility company. She didn't hesitate to open it, but the man wasn't there to check anything. His name was Richard Gerald Jordan. He was 29. What seemed like an ordinary visit turned into the darkest moment of Edwina's life. Jordan pulled out a gun and forced her into her own car. He drove her outside the city, into a wooded area in Harrison County. He made her walk among the trees. Then he executed her with a single gunshot. After that, he called Edwina's husband, pretended she was still alive, demanded a ransom of $25,000. He planned to pick up the money at a gas station, but the police were already waiting for him. He was arrested the same day. He confessed without hesitation, said he had picked the family at random, just looking for someone who looked wealthy, said it had all been planned from the start, that he never intended to leave any witnesses. In March 1976, he was sentenced to death, but his case became a legal spiral that would last decades. Appeals, overturned verdicts, new trials, motions, delays. He was sentenced to death at least 4 times for the same crime. Now, at 78 years old, Richard Gerald Jordan is the longest-serving death row inmate in Mississippi. He has spent nearly half a century awaiting execution. On June 25, 2025, the state is finally set to carry it out. Capital punishment is scheduled for that day. Mississippi allows multiple execution methods: lethal injection, nitrogen hypoxia, electric chair, or firing squad. I know some might wonder, can't they use all of them?
Execution date has been set for Mississippi's longest tenured death row inmate. 78-year-old Richard Gerald Jordan has been selected to death in 4 different trials for the Harrison County kidnapping and murder of Edwina Martyr in 1976.
Jordan has until June 10th to choose. Now, let's look beyond June. What other executions are scheduled for 2025? Byron Black. Execution scheduled for August 5th, 2025. In 1989, Byron Black, along with accomplices, broke into a family's house in Memphis, Tennessee. During the robbery, Black killed Angela Clay and her 2 daughters. The crime was especially violent, and Black was arrested after a long police pursuit. He was sentenced to death in 1990. The execution is scheduled for August 5, 2025, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, where he can choose between lethal injection or the electric chair. Timothy L. Coleman. Execution scheduled for October 30, 2025. On March 23, 1996, Timothy L. Coleman killed Melinda Stevens, a woman who had been a confidential informant for the police in Springfield, Ohio. He killed her in her home to stop her from continuing to provide information to authorities. He was arrested shortly after the crime, and during his trial it was revealed that Coleman had a history of violence. He was sentenced to death in 1997, and his execution is scheduled for October 30, 2025, at Southern Ohio Correctional Facility via lethal injection. Kareem M. Jackson. Execution scheduled for December 10, 2025. In 1995, Kareem M. Jackson and his accomplice killed Antonio Hunter and Terrence Walker during a robbery attempt in Franklin, Ohio. Jackson, in an impulsive attack, shot both victims, leaving them dead at the scene. He was arrested shortly after and sentenced to death in 1996. The execution is scheduled for December 10, 2025, at Southern Ohio Correctional Facility via lethal injection. Harold Wayne Nichols. Execution scheduled for December 11, 2025. On November 15, 1988, Harold Wayne Nichols murdered Karen Pulley, a 43-year-old woman in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Nichols, who had planned the robbery, attacked her brutally and killed her in her own home. He was arrested days after the crime. He was sentenced to death in 1990, and his execution is scheduled for December 11, 2025, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution via lethal injection or the electric chair, at the inmate's choice. Quizzy Bryan. Execution scheduled for January 7, 2026. In 1999, Quizzy Bryan, during a robbery, murdered Carla Morris, a 42-year-old white woman. Bryan, in his attempt to rob her, brutally attacked her in her home in Ohio. He beat her and strangled her, leaving her dead on the floor. When police investigated the crime, they found physical evidence linking him to the scene. He was arrested shortly after the murder. In trial, Bryan was sentenced to death in 2001. The execution is scheduled for January 7, 2026, at Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, and will be carried out via lethal injection. And now a brief recap of executions already carried out in 2025, as of today. And tell me, is there any case you'd like to know more about? Ted Bundy, Aileen Wuornos, the Menendez brothers? Let me know in the comments. What's the most shocking or memorable criminal case you've ever heard of? If you enjoy this kind of content, please like the video, leave a comment, and most importantly, subscribe to Final Sentence. Accept no imitations.